They hurled themselves off cliffs on Saipan.
Attack on the U.S. fleet, raining death from the skies. Although they had first hurled
Communists could have combined such medieval religious fervor with them.
Over the next 6 weeks, more than 2,000 Japanese planes will attack the American fleet. Nearly 5,000 U.S. sailors
Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and American
I had heard through my mother that my grandfather, while he was a very reserved man, very proper, first of all, he was very educated, and he um, became part of a very agricultural community, working class. Cane was the primary supported agriculture support for the community. And so while being very focused and stuff, he was revered as being one who could read both Japanese and English. He had to learn English when he came. And so the local people would go to him to work through whether it be taxes or contracts and stuff. So very rudimentary things. He would help the local community. And therein, I think, now this is just my perception, why maybe he was one of, I think, only 2 men from the Kauai selected to go to the concentration camp, because I think they were afraid that he might hold, a lot of political power position should he decide to align with Japan, which never happened.
Executive Order 9066 was the result of the political proselytizing of General DeWitt, who is the leader of the U.S. Army on the West Coast, was the fact that the incarceration was effectively illegal. You mentioned, as an example, the question of what amounts to sabotage or spying. There was no instance ever recorded of a Japanese American actually spying or conducting espionage on behalf of, or sabotage on that behalf of the Japanese government. In fact, 9066 limited habeas corpus during the war for people of Japanese descent. He basically made a case to President Roosevelt that he couldn't guarantee the safety of the West Coast against Japanese invasion if Japanese people were allowed to remain in society. And so 9066 was promulgated and developed in order to establish the War Relocation Authority, which basically ran the internment camps. And it stayed in effect until 1946, when the Japanese who had been institutionalized in the camps were released to return. They were treated as prisoners. They were not treated, and many of them, remember, were citizens of the United States, and yet they were treated as prisoners throughout the war. They were guarded. There were barbed wire fences. There were guard towers with machine guns. And it was a harrowing experience at best and a deadly one at worst.
For my grandmother, paternal grandmother, had been raised, the family lived for years in Hawaii prior to Pearl Harbor. She met my grandpa, who came from Japan as a young man, and of course they married, did children. And then when the war came, he was sent to the internment camp. He refused to use prison or concentration camp, so we grew up only hearing from him about the internment camp the few times he did speak.
During my professional career, I worked with the Big Basin National Park, and they have Topaz, one of the old camps, as one of their historical sites. So during visits there, I recall that Mr. Togioka was sent there as one of the camps, and we looked up his records, and sure enough, he had first gone to Manzanar in California, which is in the high desert. Then he was sent to Topaz in Utah, and then finally ended up at White Mountain, which is in Wyoming. And each of his sons visited him in one of those camps.
I guess he was suspected or thought he might harbor allegiance to Japan because he had come from Japan as a young man. But as far as I know, there were never any incidents of that.
One of the critical things to me as a historian is looking at the way they were treated getting to the camps. It was abysmal. They were put into horse barns without heat. Remember, most of this was occurring during the winter and early spring of 1942. They were ill-fed, ill-housed, ill-transported, and then they were sent to places where they had to help build the camps they were going to be incarcerated in the most godforsaken areas of the American West. The volunteering of Japanese soldiers, many of whom had been in local military units before the war, but all of whom, of course, were disbarred from being in the war or being in the units immediately after Pearl Harbor, petitioned to join. And the unit from Hawaii, which was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, was made up largely of Hawaii boys, but some California Japanese Americans as well. The effect of the 442nd was to provide a focal point for President Roosevelt's interest in showing that the Japanese were in fact a loyal community. And they had the highest award level of any unit in combat during World War II. They also had one of the highest rate of casualties.
I don't know about my uncles, but they all belong to the 442, pretty much made up of Hawaiian and California Niseis, that's Japanese American, and they went to Europe. So I presume my father and his brothers all ended up in Europe. I know for sure my father was in France for a while, but mainly in Italy. Yes, my dad, he's the eldest of the three sons, and then his two brothers, all three went separately as they were processed into the military. And part of the reason was to, I guess, to prove that there was no harboring of any allegiance to Japan, and also it was a means to see their dad at the many concentration camps that he was sent to.
They were originally stationed near Biloxi, Mississippi, which is where they took their unit training, and then they were sent to Italy. From Italy, of course, they fought up the Italian peninsula and then ultimately ended the war in France.
On the battleground, especially France, I think, he was a supply clerk because there was not much to do, and as the soldiers were coming, I guess the Navy men and Army were coming to Europe, they had to be processed and resupplied. So he did that, but in the battlefield, when they needed help retrieving bodies, he was one of the first to go.
What you mentioned a family grocery store too, if I'm correct. Do you have any stories from?
Became I think a supply clerk because he didn't want to carry weapons or have to use weaponry, and then he became a medic also.
Well, for those like your family, as an example, they went back to their old lives. They had a store in the community. They went back to the community. They were respected members of the community, and so they reintegrated fairly easily. That wasn't true, generally speaking, in many of the families in California. Under 9066, they were not allowed to retain property other than personal property. So in some cases, close friends and business associates were kind and bought up their holdings and then sold them back to them at reasonable prices after the war. But in some cases, that was not true. In fact, many Japanese businesses were taken over by profiteers, in a word, who used the facilities for their own ends during the war, and who ultimately did not return them to the Japanese families after the war, and they were not required to by law.
By the time they were giving out reparations, my grandfather had long been deceased, and in honor of him, my father and the brothers decided that they would not take reparation because he was so humiliated without saying the word or talking about it, but he had come back changed person. I think that human nature, certain things are universal. We all want to survive individually and as communities. We all want a voice. We all want to educate our children and better our children. And I think those will remain the same for generations, if as long as there are people. But it's still the right and the responsibility of everyone to protect free will, free speech, no matter what their views are.
This notion that you can judge people from afar and in earnest before they exhibit behavior that is considered to be criminal in this context is foolish when it's applied to a population as a whole. Populations don't become terrorists. Individuals become terrorists. And until we come to grips with a method of trying to determine whether a person is going to be a terrorist as opposed to a class of people or a nation of people, our policies are likely to fail. In effect, what we will be doing is keeping out lots and lots of good people because of our fear of one person. And if that's rational, then I'm not a rational man, because I don't believe that. We have to judge individuals just as we judge our own citizens on the basis of their individual actions, so we should judge people who want to come and live here on the basis of their actions as well.
And I've had frequent conversations with my own family about our family history. And this has been an ongoing project. This isn't the first time I've tried to actually make this, but this is the only project that's been successful so far. I still think there's more work because with family history projects, it's always ongoing because you get new family, you find old family, you find out a lot of new information about people you thought you knew very well, and it's probably going to be an ongoing project even after this. That was one of my hopes that I was in the process of making this, was to hopefully get people to think about their own families, because there's a lot of unsaid things between family members that I think are important to know, like your roots. And at a certain point, a lot of old family members will die, and you'll lose that information and that history because maybe like your parents don't know anything about how your original family came here, and you just lose all of that history.